Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. I am Sebastian Burka, the Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are very happy to host Professors Fiona Scott Morton, Tommaso Valletti, and Bo Cowgill, who was able to join us at the last minute for a conversation moderated by Filippo Lancieri on lobbying and influence in markets. The discussion will be based on a project by Cowgill and Valletti together with Fabrizio Dell'Acqua and Andrea Prat that studies how firms lobby. And before we begin, please note that we are on the record and we will post the video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 15 minutes or so, and you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And we hope that you will join us for more upcoming webinars. So please check our website as well as our publication promarket.org and our Capitalism podcast. And now please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Bo Cowgill is an assistant professor at Columbia Business School. Fiona Scott Morton is the Theodore Nierenberg Professor of Economics at the Yale School of Management. And Tommaso Valletti is Professor of Economics and the head of the Department of Economics and Public Policy at the Imperial College London Business School. Last but not least, our moderator today is Filippo Lancieri, who is a research fellow at the Stigler Center and a JSD candidate at the University of Chicago Law School. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you a lot for joining us. I just want to say some introduction remarks that this is part of our long-standing conference. We've been hosting it for kind of a year now to understand the relationship between monopolies or market power and political power. And this is kind of like the second half. So we started really discussing more historical examples, and you can find most of the movies and the discussions on our YouTube page. We went through Nazi Germany, Latin America, to Israel, through the US to try to understand what we know about this history of this connection. And then the second half that we've been hosting mostly now during the winter has been about to understand more like what is the current state nowadays. So how we think about policy design, policy reforms, and what do we know about the relationship right now. So we're really happy when Bo and Tommaso and Andrea and Fabrizio, they all agreed to present this work that they're developing that really tackles this question, I think, about how this is taking place in the US. So they want to take too much of the time. So Tommaso, I'll give it to you, the floor, and please take it on.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Filippo, and thank you to the Stigler Center for having us. It's really exciting. And what I'm going to present is very much related to a series of topics that the Stigler Center has been covering over the last few years, in fact. So there is recent empirical evidence suggesting that market economies are changing, perhaps in some fundamental ways. And I'm referring to recent work on markups, which are going high, so they're going up. So the ability to price above some measure of cost, some evidence that aggregate industry concentration is on the rise, that there is a decline in the labor share of output, an increase in the share of profits, share of output as well. Some evidence that there is inequality in income, of course, within countries, but also among firms. There is a growing inequality and a reduction in business dynamism. These are elements which are coming together now. The causes of these changes, of course, and the policy conclusions that can be drawn are still a subject to a very lively debate. We all have some opinions about it, but there is some evidence there, and we want to add an additional element. So we are still interested in industries, and we want to see how our industry, how businesses actually lobby. There is competition in the market, but it's also competition for political power. So I'm going to share you a presentation of the work which I've been doing with, okay, share screen. I'm going to share my presentation. Just give me a second. There you go. It should be on everybody's screen. So this is a recent project which is still ongoing. It's it's with Bo, with Fabrizio, and Andrea. So the two main questions that we are asking are the following. We want to see whether we can correlate some measure of industrial correlation with political lobbying done by those firms. And in particular, as you will see, size matters in our empirical exercise. We want to see whether size which is coming from merging in a certain industry has a particular impact on lobbying. And we develop our arguments in two steps. We develop a theory bit, and then there is going to be an empirical application. So why firms? Firms are relevant players in this market. So if you look on the left-hand side, these are open source data. When it comes to lobbying spend, businesses represent 87% of the amount of money which is spent on lobbying. So, which makes sense somehow. When it comes to contribution from PACs, political action committees, business is still very large, although also labor and ideological contributions represent play quite a big role. But firms matters, businesses matter when it comes to lobbying. And it's not just in the US. So these are data for Europe, where I'm based, and as expected, the top spenders on EU lobbying are those that are on the slide. It's Google, it's Microsoft, but it's also Shell, it's also Exxon, it's Siemens, there are also European firms, it's Deutsche Bank, and so forth. And they spend money and they employ lobbyists, which are registered in Brussels. So it's not just the US. Let me very briefly, of course, in a presentation like today, we want to have a conversation, but let me give you a gist of our theoretical approach. So firms in our approach are going to lobby in order to influence regulations, where these regulations will make, for instance, the incumbents better off, the insiders to industry. So you can think of imposing tariffs so that foreign competition is diminished, or creating barriers to entry so that low-cost domestic competitors don't enter a particular industry with incumbents. Or you can think of other regulation, labor market regulations, and other stuff. So if they can affect and they can influence in this, and as I anticipated, size will matter in our results. The next question is specifically how a merger, because a merger will increase the size mechanically, the size of a firm will go up. We want to see how a merger will affect incentives for firms to lobby. So when you develop the theory, if you have understood, there is two elements that we need: a model of competition to deal with mergers, and a merger of lobbying to understand how regulations are going to come up in an industry. And this is what I'm going to very quickly go through. The competition model is a standard one, which has, though, some peculiarities. We want to be, despite having some functional form assumption, a bit more general, because we want to accommodate firms that can have multiple products and can merge. That's not super easy to do, to deal with mergers in multi-product firms. And the innovation, though, is going to be that this is a demand function for a product. I is a product, which depends on the own price, on the price of rival goods, and the firm can own multiple of such products. And there's a new term there, which is that one. So R is something which is an industry-wide parameter, which is the regulation that insulates incumbents from more competition from the outside. So think of barriers to entry. So an R comes from regulations, and regulations are enforced by regulators that can be lobbied. And this is the second element of the model. It's a model of campaign contributions. Each firm, on top of competing in the markets, can also make transfers to regulators. These are the representative of the politicians on the basis of the regulations that will be chosen. And then the regulations are chosen by the policymaker, who has certain preferences. Regulators do take into account welfare, so the consumer surplus of the people affected in that industry, but money. So money can be direct bribes, or can be revolving doors, or you can think of several ways of rationalizing this term that will make the regulator, the beta parameter will make the regulator tilt more in favor of the industry rather than welfare. So the higher is the beta, the easier it is to get the attention of the regulator. And the results are the following. So when you have a merger purely causing market power, so there may be, of course, efficiencies and other things, but imagine a pure market power merger. As a consequence of the merger, the regulator will enact a higher level of R, which will make the incumbents better off. So it will be more regulation, which is in the favor of the incumbents. And the intuition is that R, this industry-wide regulation, is a public good because it applies to everybody within a certain industry. So, and being a public good are typically undersupplied. There's a coordination problem unless players contributing to the public good are very large because they can internalize more of the effects of the regulation. And in particular, if you become bigger because of a merger, which you do because you put together two firms that before were separate and now they are jointly together, then there will be an increase in lobbying efforts and an increase in regulation. So you see as a consequence, this is result number 2, that a merger basically has a negative effect on consumers. One is a standard one because prices will increase. So that's something well understood, but consumers lose twice because also indirectly they lose from observing regulations which are more pro-incumbent after the merger. Okay? So they lose twice. So here there's also a nice, and something we can discuss in our discussion later, a nice complementarity between market power and regulation, in the sense that if there is lots of competition in an industry, then the benefits from lobbying are dissipated. Okay, so these two things go together, which has some policy implications. Let me now jump very quickly to the empirical part. In the empirical part, we put together 4 data sets, different sources, with information about firms. This is from CompuStat. We know all the firms that merge over the period. The period covers 20 years, the last 20 years, more or less. So Thomson Reuters, now it's called Refinitiv. SDC Platinum is a source of mergers. And then we have lobbying expenditures. If you're interested, I can tell you more. But there is an NSF-funded project, LobbyView, which is it's very nice because it gives all the lobbying expenditure, federal lobbying. So here we concentrate on lobbying at the federal level. We also add campaign contributions. Again, if you're interested, I can tell you more about Open Secrets being the data source. And these are contributions, for instance, through PACs, but also individual donations. So, and for some reasons, data are, especially in the first 10 years, are disclosed twice a year. There are some requirements. So we have about 10,000 firms that we can follow over 20 years with 2 half years in each period. So we have about just below 200,000 observations. So to do an empirical project in this area, there are many challenges. Mergers are endogenous. And also, as you will see, some of these firms merge multiple times. And I want to explain perhaps for a minute what we do in that respect. But first, this is just a visual representation of what we find. This is a graph that represents in our data sample a relationship between the amount spent on lobbying and size. So as you can see, this relationship is increasing and perhaps even convex, and it is quite robust. So the bigger you are, the more you lobby. There are no mergers yet. This is on the lobbying side. So the data source is LobbyView. If you use Open Secrets, you got on the left-hand side PACs, and also individual total donation on the right-hand side. And again, this relationship is in the data. So it's nice to see that these phenomena seem to be there across different data sets. Of course, as you start digging deeper and deeper and deeper into industries, here is an example, 3-digit level, it's chemical manufacture. You zoom in even more, you got pharmaceutical, things become more fuzzy. You have to deal with a lot of zeros because there's lots of companies that don't lobby. There's lots of companies that don't produce in the chemical industry, for instance, revenues for a few periods because they are investing, but still, this positive relationship is in the data. Okay? So first, empirical exercise we do very simple is the following. We look at an exercise like this. Imagine this is the timeline. At some stage there is a merger, and we want to see how much firms are lobbying before the merger, joint. I mean, we look at the sum, of course, or the parties before the merger and after the merger. How much do they lobby before, and how much do they lobby after? And the results here are saying that before the merger, there's some lobbying going on, and then kind of 2 years before the merger, they start going up, and then they reach a higher level after the merger. In some specification, in fact, we even find something like this, that they start lobbying, it goes up, and then before the merger, it may go even above the new the new equilibrium after the merger. Perhaps this is just suggestive evidence that lobbying may be done also to affect the outcome of the merger itself. And this is true whether we look at the whole set of firms. Here are those that merge only once, for reasons I will tell you in a moment, or just sticking only to the merging firms. The result happens in the data. Then we have a problem though. The problem is that most of the companies which are large never merge with another large company, but those who do may do it multiple times. So the strategy I showed you before that was relying on this before and after cannot really work, because you have a merger now that becomes a before for the next merger. So we have to devise a different approach that we do by constructing composite firms. And I want to explain what these composite firms are. This is a cluster of firms that sooner or later becomes grouped together at the end of our sample. And we are going to exploit the within composite firm variation over time. So this is what what I'm going to show you in the data in the next slide. We want to see the total lobbying of firms that do merge. If in the merger, say, if size didn't matter, it was related to something else, there would be some linear term related to size, but this quadratic term should play no role. Should play no role, because if I have two firms worth 1 and 1, before the sum is 2, after is 2, if the merger itself doesn't matter, the quadratic term should not play any role in the data. And instead, if you find evidence that the quadratic term matters, it corroborates this idea that this internalization of the lobbying results comes from our theory is in the data as well. And this is composite firm fixed effect. So let me guide you through an example, which is very simple to understand what's going on. Here there are 4 firms at the beginning, A, B, C, D. And then they merge first pairwise into A, B, and C, D. And finally, they get to the final result. This is the end game, A, B, C, D. But originally there were 4 component firms, A, B, C, and D. And we observe 3 points in time, 1, 2, 3. We're going to capture the composite fixed effects for ABCD, but the components at first there were 4 constituents going down to 2, ending up in 1. The total revenue by construction hasn't changed. So if you didn't have any size effect, the total revenue dictating lobbying efforts, that would be enough. Instead, the quadratic term goes up by a lot because of the concentration. Okay? So, and this is what I want to show you, and then I'm done with my short presentation in the results on this slide. So the first column is saying, as we reduce the number of component firms, in the example before, you started with 4, then you went to 2, and then you went to 1. So you have a reduction. That's why there is a negative sign. This is anytime you remove one firm from the composite firm, ABCD, every time you remove one element, one merger, lobby goes up. These are half-year data, goes up by $85,000 in our sample on average. Okay, so every time you remove a firm via a merger, compared to the before, the after, you have an increase in $85,000. The second column is just a repetition of the same exercise, but just by looking at the concentration measure so that people are more familiar with concentration instead of seeing this number of firms going down. And the last column is simply, this is other stuff in the regressions to show you that this quadratic term that should be 0 if size did not matter, instead seems to be positive and significant. So this is some preliminary results I wanted to share with you. And I will conclude by commenting on the complementarity and between antitrust laws and campaign finance law and lobbying regulation, in the sense that if you have very well designed campaign finance laws and lobbying regulations, it means it's not possible to do this regulation in the favor of incumbents, and therefore the incumbents will not be able to, keep foreign competitors out or something like this, which makes the job of the antitrust enforcer an easier one. And vice versa, if you have a very, very vibrant competition, and if you have very good enforcers on the antitrust, on the competition policy side, which do not allow anti-competitive rents to be earned, then the advantages from doing lobbying in the sense of just described are also reduced, which makes the job of the regulators of lobbying an easier one. So it's a nice complementarity in our opinion. Things that we have to do are many, as you can guess, but the most interesting one is that until now, I've kept lobbying data and campaign donation data separate. And I think instead it would be nice to see also the interaction between those, because a business might devise a strategy playing the two against each other or combining the two, and this is something that we haven't done yet. But I'll stop here and I'll stop sharing my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tommaso, for a great presentation. This was a bit more technical than what we are using this series, and not everyone is a PhD economist, including me. Actually, I'm not a PhD economist. So I was chosen on purpose as a moderator to, before I pass to Fiona, to ask a couple of questions to kind of like go on the results. So would your theory foresee that the larger the firm, the more incentive it has to lobby? So is this something related to the size of the firm, or how concentrated the market is? So is this something like a fixed cost? That as soon as the firm gets big, it learns how to lobby, so you start lobbying everywhere? Or is it like something related to the dynamic of the industry that would foresee that because of the industry dynamics, the firm is going to lobby more?
So this is a great question, as there is going to be a bit of both. In fact, in the way we see the data, which I not present, it's a fixed cost that not everybody in the industry can afford the lobbying process. So it's a fixed cost that you have to pay in order to have access. But then over and above the fixed cost, it's really something related to your size in your industry, because this is the internalization, the whole theoretical. So we see that in the data, but also in the theory, which I tried to explain. It is the ability to internalize this public good. It's a public bad in this example, but your ability to reap the effects from the public good becomes bigger the higher the share that you represent in that industry. So if you have a very concentrated industry, it is a mechanism that you would expect to arise from size relative to the industry. But the fixed cost is important to also explain why in the data we observed a lot of zeros, because there's like a minimum level that you have to reach before you start lobbying. That's what we seem to, the theory and the data seem to be reconciled in that respect.
Okay, so the idea is that like, if you lobby, but then you benefit everyone, you kind of spend the money and don't internalize the money for the company yourself. But if the market's more concentrated, then you're lobbying, you get more of the money yourself, so you have more incentive to continue lobbying, and it becomes like a self-fulfilling effect.
Precisely. Very good.
Okay, and then just another question before then we move to Fiona for a comment. So, so I'm gonna just want to share quickly. So how do we know that it isn't because as firms get larger, they're just lobbying to more areas? No, they become, so this is data from LobbyView actually for Facebook. And if you look, this is from 2012, when Facebook was actually acquiring Instagram. Facebook was a very big company, it already had $5 billion in revenue. And then it mostly lobbying like computer science industry, homeland security, immigration, and things like this, media. And then once Facebook's become bigger, so 2020, you see the number of lobbying areas grows to like 23. And then it grows to like tax reforms, homeland security, law enforcement. You can even see here that Facebook spent $12,000 last year on antitrust issues, trying to block the litigation against them. So how would you say that like the results that you find are just not capturing the like mechanical effect that as firms get bigger, they're just bigger conglomerates and they lobby everywhere versus like something related to their market power in particular?
But in a sense, this is what we are trying to do with our quadratic terms. If that was just a mechanical effect from being bigger in several markets, then you wouldn't expect to obtain the results that we have. And so it's, another interesting point that perhaps we can discuss is that the amount of money that we seem to capture doesn't seem to be that big. Okay, so I showed you there were $3 billion. I mean, these are lots of money for common mortals, but since the economy is so much bigger, and then it's important to say a few things. And people in the past have attributed this to the fact that perhaps lobbying is not very effective, or perhaps there is a consumption value. People lobby just to be next to the politicians. But I want to say a few things. If you look at the trends, lobbying has been going up by quite a bit in the last 20 years. So some of the statistics we have in the past have to be revised. And the other point is perhaps it's a reflection of the theory. We think that sometimes lobbying isn't in equilibrium so high because of this public good problem. Instead, as you see in those industries that become concentrated, instead money follows the concentration as well. So it's in our opinion, an important clarification. This is what we seem to be capturing in the data.
Okay, that's great. So I'll pass it on to Fiona to have some comments about what this means for like broader implications of what we're thinking about antitrust, and then we'll get back to the discussion afterwards.
So thanks very much for the invitation to be here from the Stigler Center, and also thanks to Tommaso for a great presentation and a really interesting paper. The paper is about both mergers and also just concentration itself. I think, as far as I can tell from the empirical work, there's a study of both of those things. And I think that's interesting because you might imagine that firms are lobbying the government more generally, as we saw, say, under the Trump administration for Sprint and T-Mobile, let us merge. So they start lobbying and then they merge. But you also might imagine that after you've merged to monopoly, for example, and there aren't any more mergers to do, this paper says that you keep on lobbying. And why do you keep on lobbying? That's to create barriers to entry, to stop anybody else from getting in, to disrupt your monopoly, and also to allow yourself to have higher markups. As we've seen over the last 30 years, markups have been rising. How do you get those higher markups? In the airline industry, you hide fees from consumers. You don't let them compare information. You don't refund their money when you cancel flights. All of these kinds of things that require the Department of Transportation to issue favorable regulations so that you can increase your profits. So both of those are reasons to lobby. What's the big antitrust point here? I think in recent years, that there actually is one that's pretty nice. In recent years, we've had this debate between what I'll call the traditional antitrusters and people who say, look, our framework for antitrust isn't broad enough. It should be taking into account more things. So the traditional framework takes into account price, quality, and innovation, and that today and tomorrow, okay? And those are the consumer harms that you can have from anti-competitive conduct that count under the antitrust laws. The school of thought that calls itself neo-Brandeisian says, well, we should have more things in there like democracy and political power and so on. And I haven't seen much specific articulation of that. And I think that this paper falls neatly into that category. So you could say, look, another thing that happens that after a merger that is a harm is an increase in lobbying, and that increase in lobbying can be expected to raise markups and to transfer money from consumers to producers. So it is indeed another kind of consumer harm, but the channel through which it flows is not price, quality, or innovation, but rather lobbying. And I think this would be a nice way to frame the paper for the authors. A second thing that I wanted to just point out is to get there, you have to do a little bit of theory, right? What the authors show is you lobby to get market power, you have market power, you lobby. Why do we think that that's hurting the consumers? Well, we think that the firms are lobbying to maximize their profits, and we think that profits are not the same thing as consumer surplus. And therefore, we think that the lobbying is going to be designed to create rules that transfer consumer surplus into profit. All of that is a little outside the paper, but it's perfectly supported by normal theory. What's an example of this? If you look at what the Trump administration did in the last few days of its term, they allowed a code sharing between JetBlue and American Airlines. What does that mean? That essentially means legally they don't have to compete anymore. They can set prices together and set routes together. So it's kind of similar to a merger, but it's done by DOT, not the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice said, sure, this sounds fine to us, just before the administration's changed over. We've had enormous amounts of mergers in the airline industry, 8 down to 4. JetBlue is a sort of a disruptive maverick type of competitor. The last thing we want, in my view, would be to take that competitor out and have them effectively merge with American Airlines. Why would the Department of Transportation approve something so contrary to the public interest and the interest of the traveling public? Probably it's lobbying from JetBlue and American Airlines. Now, interestingly, and contrary to the theory in the paper, why do we know about this? Because Southwest and Spirit are lobbying against it, right? They're actually coming out and saying, we don't want this, this merger because it's going to hurt us. So that's a little counterexample to Tommaso's part about the idea of the public good. Here, this particular case, the lobbying is not about a public good. It's about something that helps American gain advantage over Southwest. Southwest doesn't like it, so they're going to lobby back again. So it'd be interesting to hear your guys' reaction to that. And then the last thing I wanted to say was that the Biden administration has reportedly been considering a kind of a White House competition function, which is not designed to do antitrust enforcement. That's independent agencies do that, but rather to bring competition concerns to places like the Department of Transportation and the Department of Agriculture. And we would expect with this paper as a background that could be quite effective, that if there's been many decades of under enforcement, lots of rising concentration, rising lobbying, rising market power, that has turned itself into rules that protect incumbents and harm consumers at the level of the Department of Transportation, the FDA, the Department of Agriculture, and that maybe a good pro-competitive function would be to assess those rules and try to get rid of the ones that hurt consumers and entrench the monopoly and the market power. So I'll stop there and open it up, but thanks, great paper.
Go ahead, Tommaso, if you want to say something. Or Bo as well, please.
Yeah. So, and by the way, if Bo, you want to interject at any time. So a few things. There is a couple of questions also in the chat, and then I'll respond to Fiona. First is understanding what's in the data. What can we do with the data? So this is a project which is interesting because it captures, in a sense, the bigger picture. If you want to have specific things about the specific company, the Facebook, etc., then you do more a case study on that company. Our approach, of course, will have so many details that we cannot bring in. But anyway, the data are good, have been used in our studies as well. There are also limitations. So let me say the limitations. As far as lobbying expenditures are concerned, from lobbying view, one limitation is driven by US transparency laws. So the US transparency law, my understanding is that you have to disclose if there is direct lobbying. So these are in-house lobbying. or a company's own lobbying. Instead, if a company donates money to an intermediary who then hires a lobbyist, this is not captured in our data. So this may also put a little bit the dimension of our results in the prospect. Maybe you have to think of a multiplier. So as long as these things move together, we are still capturing an important effect. But to have the real effect on the economy, you have to scale up. And on campaign contributions, we have contributions from companies, political action committees, also contribution for the employees or the owners of an organization, from the family members of those individuals. Okay, so that's all captured. But if instead what's called dark money through super PACs, etc., this would not be captured. But these are common problems that are encountered in the literature too. But this is what we have. I mean, an empirical project of this scale has to be dictated also by data availability, I should say. The other point, more related to what Fiona was saying, is that I think it's great, and I'm not here to make a compliment to the Stigler Center. I am making a compliment actually to the Stigler Center, because it's important that we make the discussion wider. So for many years, discussion when it comes to antitrust, but also regulation, these are called thin political markets. So markets where there is no politics for the average voter, because they're very narrow thing. They may be important, but they are not as salient as defense or terrorism or employment or taxation issues. So we don't typically vote over those things, and it's left to the experts. Okay? And here we are experts here, but leaving to the experts are subject to influence and lobbying as anyone else in the economy. So we need to expand a little bit. We need to pull down a little bit the barriers of this conversation so that other views are taken into account too. Whether this relates to the consumer surplus or not, it's important for democracy, I think, that these discussions are extended beyond the narrow boundaries of competition policy. Of course, it has to be done by the experts in the end, but it's important that we expose ourselves to more opinions and a different variety of views. So that's why I think all the job that you're doing at the Stigler Center, hopefully including the discussion we're having today and the kind of project we're doing, which is not the typical project we do in antitrust, is valuable, hopefully.
Thanks a lot. And we are getting many good questions already, so please feel free to send them. I don't want to have a monopoly over the conversation here. So I think I wanted to kickstart the discussion a bit, talking about what do you think is this effectiveness of lobbying. No? You mentioned a little bit before, Tommaso, that the number is really low. It's like $3 billion a year, and the gains are gigantic. So what do you think your research says about lobbying versus other areas? And I think Fiona and Bo, feel free to jump in as well, like revolving doors or other things that wouldn't show up in the data itself.
Yeah, this is somehow, I was trying to anticipate this with saying this could be, imagine scaling up, because lobbying happens in different ways. Lobbying happens also through think tanks. Lobbying happens through through employing people. So by finding, I think we are trying to at least to convince the general public or the academics that there is something going on already at this level. Instead, until now, we were hearing more the view that lobbying is not really happening, is not really affecting decisions. And we have, you know, in our data set, we have lots of firms, very small ones, very big ones. So the more we delve into this, the more we will be able also to tell you whether there are specific sectoral sectors which are more, which are driving the results. So there is something I cannot tell you for now. But it's important to raise awareness to this problem which exists, which seems to be at least out there. And again, in our paper, we can do something very limited. I don't know whether this lobbying has been good or has been bad, because that's not the focus of this paper. But if I match this, this is like forensic evidence. We are trying to put together elements of a puzzle, and the puzzle has, technology changing, market shares becoming higher, concentration of industries going up, markups going up, labor share going down. So put this together, you have a picture which is going more in a certain direction than in another one. If you know my opinion about this is specifically, we haven't enforced well in the past 20 years. The United States has done worse than Europe. I come from Europe. I had an experience as an enforcer for a bit before coming back to academia. So I do see some responsibilities, and this is also a good, point in time to reverse a little bit some decisions that were taken in the past, and we should change.
Fiona, had anything to add or to say something or not?
No, I kind of wanted to hear what Bo had to say about the public good issue and the as evidenced by Southwest versus American, for example.
Sure. Well, yeah, I don't know how you knew, but I was going to ask you. I was going to follow up with you on this exact point. That's a question that we've debated a good amount in our co-author group. Should we model this as a public good or is there some notion where you actually want firms to lobby more because within an industry there could be differences. So we've settled on this model for now, but I am curious, and I think that has merits. It's hard to quantify exactly what percentage of overall cases look like our public goods model versus something else. But I was curious for how you felt about the generalizability of the public goods model, how it would change implications in our ability to speak to questions about Brandesian type of things. Had we taken the other route, because I still think that there could be kind of it may actually not be that good even still to have lots of competing firms all lobbying the government in different directions. It may not still kind of what you want is the consumers kind of lobbying in some sense. But anyway, sorry.
Consumers are supposed to lobby by voting, but that doesn't seem to be
right.
Well. So I think one interesting empirical question I would have for you guys is what you can say about trade associations and groups that are exactly trying to get around the free rider problem and the public good problem. If a lot of lobbying in an industry is done by the trade association for that industry, probably what they're lobbying for is generally good for all firms at the expense of consumers, or possibly grows the pie, but certainly the former you would expect, and not something that advantages one firm over another. And it would be interesting to know what the ratio of group spending is to individual spending in some sense.
Sure.
And what relationship that has to concentration, because you could imagine a super organized industry that did a lot of group spending could do a lot of damage, even though there wasn't a lot of concentration.
Right. Yes, you're saying.
Yes.
We could do that. We could do that analysis. And one just caveat, which some people may care more or less about, depending on how engaged they are technically to the data in this. So Tommaso was saying we don't have this industry group data. Well, that lobbying data actually does exist. The problem is linking that back to a firm. But we could link both firms and industry groups back to industries or NAIC codes to be more specific. And I think that would let us do the kind of analysis that you're suggesting that I agree could kind of get at the heart of this question.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of questions in the chat, and we already started engaging in some, but I wanted to ask the question from Geoffrey Mane, because it's a good question, I think, that Fiona started discussing already in the chat. So how do you know that this isn't some kind of like defensive lobbying, which is that like big firms would expect small firms to lobby against them, and then they try to do the opposite to kind of just protect when they are more efficient? I think that's a summary of the question.
I mean, so let me just say what I answered. I think, like basic economic theory, let's start with the low-hanging fruit. Before I devise a model that's got 16 moving parts and some second-order implications, why don't we just go with the kind of basic, the firm pays the regulator to increase their profits? That seems like the way we ought to be thinking about this first, and trying to see how far we can get with that model rather than starting down some road of what are the small firms doing that's
but
different.
we are even more more parsimonious in our assumptions. We are not, it would be obvious to say, I want to pay the regulator to protect my own profit. Here we are simply saying existing firms are paying the regulator to protect the existing market structure, including the small firms, So we are distinguishing between the incumbents in an industry and those which are still the outsiders to an industry, and they want to be protected from the outsiders. And including the small firms, we want to be protected from the outsiders, but simply because they're small, they don't internalize a big effect and they will not lobby a lot. So we can account for any firm size within an industry.
Yeah, and what Jeff wanted proof of was that when firms lobby for regulations, those regulations increase their profits. And I mean, that would be a nice paper to write, and I would encourage him to go off and write it. I think basic theory tells us that that's what they have to be doing, or their shareholders should be replacing the management. So it's not.
And don't forget also, in our approach, Fiona, sorry for interrupting you, that there is a regulator, there is the guy who decides which is also maximizing consumer surplus. So whatever is good for consumers is also in the objective function of the regulator, but the regulator on top of that also includes the money which is spent on lobbying, which may tilt or in a certain
right. I mean, there could be weights on those, right?
Yeah, yes. It was the beta in the
Yeah. So we have a question here from Paul Valentini that I want to ask and then build on. So she asks, in this model, regulation means either antitrust interventions or ex-ante regulation, and if not, how would you separate them? And I think somewhat connected to this question, I think they're going a little bit more into the policy discussion. So what would you design as a policy intervention here? Because it seems to me that like a lot, when you get very big firms, what we do is to regulate them. And that's actually what the Stigler report proposed in relation to digital platforms, for example. But this seems to only open more room for firms to lobby even more and get even more regulation on their behalf. So how would you what would you say in terms of policy about the kind of implementation and kind of enforcement that it would get to make sure that these companies don't get so big and we have so many opportunities to do this lobbying and to protect their profits in the first place?
So on the first part, the model in general to think about it's more about regulations than competition policies as such. So firms lobby in order to be protected from competitors outside the industry. And so this is what the model is actually trying to capture. If you saw though in the empirical application, and we can easily do an extension. This is something that Andrea and I are actually doing. You can also make sure the lobby is done to affect the likelihood of approval of the merger. So it's not a difficult extension to do. I didn't present it. And then it would produce the kind of empirical behavior, which I told you. You start with some lobbying, you go up, you go very much high at first to affect the outcome of competition policy, the merger approval, and then it goes down to a steady state, which is still higher than the pre-merger steady state. So these things can be accommodated. And you can lobby also to, I mean, for instance, now there is a debate, shall we reverse the burden of proof in merger assessments in the United States, yes or no? This is a kind of lobbying that would affect the ability to merge or not, to affect a particular industrial structure. If you reverse the burden of proof in a merger assessment, you make mergers less likely, for instance. And so the ability to reap the rents goes down, there will be less lobbying and less concentration. Instead, if lobbying is used to convince that we should not reverse the burden of proof, it's the opposite that will come. Concentration becomes even higher, becoming higher, there will be more lobbying, and et cetera, with all the consequences. So the model, I think, is general enough. We had more in mind regulations, but competition policy can be part of the discussion as well.
Yeah, so I think that a short answer to your question, Filippo, is of course what Tommaso said, more vigorous antitrust enforcement keeps concentration from growing. That in and of itself stops the lobbying from growing. So that's one channel. And then there's a second channel of if you have to regulate anyway, which we often do because we want drugs to be safe and cars to be safe and online content to be safe and so on, then how do you stop the firms in question from writing those regulations themselves? One way is disclosure. Another way would be to prohibit the amount, the expenditure of money in this way. And another way is to attempt to set up your agency to make the capture of it a little bit harder. So that would be, you know, what I observed when I was at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, that one of the things that makes thinking like the industry less probable is that people move from one kind of matter to another, like briskly across the year. So one minute you're doing something about television, and then the next it's small marine hoses, and the next it's you know, some hospital, nonprofit hospital or whatever. And when you have that change of scene, it stops you getting into a rut thinking that this industry is very marvelous. Whereas at the Department of Transportation, all you do is airlines all day, every day for years, and you just start to think like an airline. So there's, I think, a number of tools that we could use designing these agencies that would help with that.
And including also, for instance, disclosure requirements that we don't have in academia. Sometimes discussions are, you know, high level enough not to require those disclosures, but often instead they are specific to particular firms, and there are many academics or semi-academics or people involved in think tanks that repeatedly do not disclose the funding of their organizations, or they just say we receive funds for multiple organizations, and they're very proud of that, but that's not enough. Or we wrote an article that was not paid for the specific purpose of this article, but still these people are doing consulting, earning millions and millions working for those companies. And these things are very difficult to fight, but especially in thin political market, this is exactly the type of exposure that we are trying to bring out.
And I think this leads to another good question that we have here. From William McGraw, that he asks, it is hard to imagine that lobbying can be quantified in the context of actual dollars expended by large companies and understand their effect upon legislation. Then he mentions, that's what I wanted to build on, that nowhere in the data you actually see smaller firms and taxpayers having a seat at the table. So I think this connects to this question about thin political markets. And I was wondering, what could you do to make these markets less thin? Because we discussed a little bit like trade associations, and they can represent even the smaller companies. Because in a way, when you have this increasing market power, and I think this relates a bit to what we're discussing about the airline case, like the competitors also lose. So isn't it a way to fight this by kind of trying to give more voice to smaller companies and to competitors and make it easier for them to intervene in the process?
I have one comment on that. The Klobuchar bill released last week has in it an idea of a competition advocate or a consumer advocate that's going to be funded by the government and is somewhat independent and goes out and finds things like this and has the ability to subpoena data and can write reports and draw attention to problems that the consumer is facing. So this is maybe one kind of response to you, Filippo. Sorry, Tommaso, you go ahead.
No, that's a great example, but in general, Filippo, this is a fundamental problem. This is Mankur-Olsen theory of collective action. Consumers, by definitions, are not representative because they cannot get their act together. So there are consumer association, consumer representative now and then, but you don't have, I don't know, I mean, in the UK, if there is a mobile merger, you don't have an organization that will put together 66 million users of mobile telephony in the UK. You just cannot. So this is a problem which is fundamental. How do you deal with that? In different ways. One way is embedded, in a sense, in the consumer welfare standard. So in principle, as economists, we would want to have the total welfare, including firms, but firms, they know how to talk to regulators. They are repeated clients of regulators. They even pay for the politicians who elect the regulators. They are always there. They're always there. And therefore, you should not, they know how to be heard. Okay, their voices for sure will be heard maybe too many times. Instead, the voices, the missing ones, are the consumers. And that's why the regulators are, in a sense, it's embedded, it's in the DNA to try to focus at least the attention on consumers alone, not because we don't care about firms, not at all, but because typically the arguments of the firms, you are damn sure that they will be heard. Instead, the consumers are not there. But there are other ways. So, for instance, again, Luigi Zingales has done a lot of good job trying to attract the attention of academics to study particular problems which are relevant. In my field, for instance, there is a tendency sometimes to have ignored it for many years because of lack of data, and IO is very much data driven, and without data you don't go very far. And when it comes, for instance, to the big tech, we never had any data available. So Luigi even tried to say, let's have a repository, let's try to have a legislation. It's not to regulate firms, but to make sure that some of this data can be given to the academics who can do the good job, and so the attention of smart people is attracted to real problems. So there is many potential tentative solutions, but there is an underlying fundamental problem, which is this lack of representation for the bigger market, which is again the saliency of part of this is making all of this debate, accessible to more people, so that they can have an opinion about it, and they can vote for politicians who will represent them and their own views in the appropriate places.
Yeah, competition is hard to explain to consumers because it's a small amount of money on so many things. Your cell phone plan costs another $3.20. The bread costs 10 cents. The car costs, because of cartels around the world, the car costs another $50, $100. Is this going to motivate you to vote? But when you add it all up, the purchasing power of your income doesn't go as far when you have to buy at monopoly prices, just everything, right? So we have a problem in this country in that way.
I want to put, Filippo, if you allow me, a great quote that came just a few weeks ago from the former president from Microsoft, Brad. And it was commented specifically on PACs.
One slide, Tommaso.
Yeah, you
Sorry?
moved the slide. You need the quote. We want the quote back again.
Yeah.
Happen here. Can you see this?
No,
There's usually a little delay, so I don't see it yet, but it will come.
It doesn't matter.
There, now I can see it.
There's something wrong with my
connection. Now you can see. I think it's telling that it's important to be on PACs, or you want to have a seat on the table, right?
Yeah, this is the same reason that there's a detailing people visit doctor's offices every week. They develop a relationship with the doctor and the office manager, and they get them to prescribe the drug.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask, there's a great question from Jeffrey Carter here, that's whether you would favor some kind of exit tax, so like some kind of prohibition on that whoever goes to government cannot lobby on that position for some years. I think there's already some restrictions on that in some places, or 2 years without consulting at all, like if you're an academic and you go to the government and then you come back, then you cannot, like, would you favor a proposition like this? What do you think, Bo? I'll start with you.
Definitely. So I can be, and then Fiona can express herself for the US, but I have my own experience. So for 3 years, I was chief economist for competition of the European Commission. And so
Also put your microphone by your mouth. You're just very quiet all of a sudden.
Can you hear me now? Good. So a personal experience. I'm very much in favor of reducing revolving doors. I have observed 3 years as an enforcer at the European Commission as chief economist for competition. I was in Brussels, but I was often in Washington as well. And I saw that the officials at the European Commission have much less revolving doors than in the United States, much less. Okay? So I don't know if it is by preferences or what it is. Is there a stigma tax? Some do go in the private sector, but most don't. And instead, in the United States, it's not the people working for the agency. So there's great staff at the FTC and the DOJ, but everyone in the front office of the big cheese of the DOJ or the FTC, they stay there a couple of years and then they go and work for the big law firms. I even spoke, I'm not going to mention names, but there was somebody very highly ranked in the DOJ that when I was at the ABA meetings for antitrust in Washington, we were having lunch at the same table. Basically, when I asked this person, how's it going? What are you doing? He basically said, oh, you know, I've got 2 kids in college. I'm earning only whatever, $250,000 a year. And so I'm just waiting for the next good offer so that I can go back into the private sector. And these things are bad. And these things are bad. It shouldn't happen. So you have to regulate in a tougher way. I'm not saying forever, but now the revolving doors are just too easy, and that's not good.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. People would say you wouldn't get this person in the first place. Like you get very top, like chief economists, and you get very top people at the DOJ, the FTC, exactly because they kind of feel like they go there, they work 4 years, they do the public good, and then afterwards they do something else.
Well,
Maybe they wouldn't go in the first place.
Yeah, let me just weigh in for a second. The way we do the chief economist roles, by taking them out of academia, that necessarily limits it to 2 years, because the university is not going to let you go away for 4 or 5 years and then come back to your tenured position. So if you want the academic to do it, you have to hold their job. If you want to hold their job, it can't be for very long. And so you end up with these 2-year stints. So that's maybe specific to particular economist jobs. With regard to the political appointees, those people are not welcome in the next administration. They are going to be fired. So there's a sort of necessary revolving door in a way that I don't see in the bureaucrats. The professional bureaucrats that are going to stay forever seem to go up higher in Europe, and they have a long career, which is, I think, better paid, you know, nice working conditions, more responsibility. You circulate across agencies. And that is like a viable, fun thing to do if you're pretty skilled. And somehow we have not, that level of person doesn't seem to exist quite so much in the United States. We seem to stop the career bureaucrats and start the political people, and then we have to rotate them out every time there's a new president.
Okay, and then I have a final question that we'll finish because we're concluding here. And then there's a question from Antonio Drossos, and he's asking, if lobbying has so much negative impacts, why is it that we cannot hold regulators accountable? So someone is going to have to put some pressure on them. So which way would you have to try to ensure the regulators are more accountable to consumers and to other markets, and that we can better understand that they're doing a bad job and that we could replace them somehow? Is this something that's
let me answer for the US, and then I'll turn it over to the other guys. If the regulator is largely going to be an agency, so it's going to be the Department of Agriculture, it's going to be the federal, Food and Drug Administration, it's going to be the Federal Communications Commission. They're writing the rules for their industry that keep out entrants and entrench monopolists. Who do those people report to? They report to the president, ultimately. They're a cabinet secretary. They're very powerful. The only person who can discipline them is the president. So there isn't a way to do this unless you have buy-in at the very top that competition is important and that regulation should protect consumers and competition.
When it comes to Europe, we have the courts, as they also have in the United States. So there is scrutiny, and the European Commission loses many times. There are 2 levels of judicial system. There's European Court and the General Court, and then this is useful. So usually these are very independent people coming from a totally different stream of thoughts, and so this is helpful. It's not the only way. You can much improve. For instance, again, as an economist who is empirically inclined, I would like to see much more independent assessments of the decisions of the enforcers. And instead now, the FTC, the DOJ, sometimes they do some ex post assessment, they do them in-house. And so there's a conflict of interest. And this instead have to be subcontracted out. The CMA, the competition authorities in the UK, instead is much more open to that. They also want to learn from mistakes, which is great. Some instead institutions, including the European Commission, they see stigma if mistakes are reported. Instead, I would say that if you're a good enforcer, you have to push yourself, because there is lots of discussion which are in gray areas. I mean, it's not always a slam dunk, because sometimes you have to push yourself because it's new industries, untested cases, untested theories of harm. And if you are a good regulator, you have to take on the challenge. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And so for me, losing in front of courts is not such a big thing. And football analogy, if you win 70% of the time, you are the biggest and best team in the world. And instead, there is a legal culture inside the organization that you have to win all the time, which means also a very risk-taking attitude that people go only for the easy ones or the non-controversial one. And this is a culture that is difficult to fight, but it exists in organizations.
Great. Well, I'd like to say the final words. If you're a benevolent dictator, what would you impose as an immediate measure to kind of improve the situation around lobbying or something like this?
I wanted to say two things. First of all, well, three things. I'm happy that we've progressed so quickly from agreeing that this is going on, which I think, you know, we will have even more evidence in our paper, to talking about solutions. On the solutions, though, there were two things I was going to bring up. First of all, lots of plain vanilla campaign finance type of regulations and good government regulations, I think, would address this problem, even if it's not explicitly motivated or targeted by the animating forces of our model and this idea that, you know, you lobby more, that, you know, helps you raise prices and this sort of thing. The other thing on the much more radical extreme is that some people have suggested the idea of putting some political lobbying tests more explicitly into the merger guidelines. So there are various HHI measures of concentration in product markets where you can do the same exact thing in lobbying and influence markets and say, well, who has quote unquote too much influence according to a simple application of these HHI metrics, and then possibly, you know, view different mergers or different industries differently depending on whether they, you know, they seem to be too concentrating in lobbying metrics. I think that's a lot more radical. It's interesting though, and possibly one application of the data that we have gathered is just to use those same benchmarks that are currently being applied for consumer markets to influence markets. So.
Okay, with that, I'll thank everyone very much, especially those attending and sending questions and participating. Thank you, Fiona, Bo, Tommaso, everyone, also Andrea and Fabrizio for the paper. It was a great discussion, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
You,
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.